Hello and welcome to A Call to Arms, a series of interviews discussing a range of issues relevant to defence with UK practitioners at the top of their profession. I'm Andy Young and I work for the Military Sciences Research Group here at the Royal United Services Institute on Whitehall. Each month, I will host an interview with a senior leader from within the UK Armed Forces, exploring the issues that face defence today and tomorrow, giving you the inside story on how the military orientates itself to face future challenges. This series is kindly supported by Airbus, a company that employs 12,500 people around the UK and contributes £7 billion to UK GDP. This month on A Call to Arms, we talk to Major General Jez Bennett, Director Capability for Land. Royal Artillery Officer by trade, Major General Bennett has held command at regiment and brigade and is the Regimental Colonel Commandant. Away from the gunners, he has held appointments in MOD as Colonel Army Resource and Plans, Head of Capability Plans in Finn Milcap, and as Chief of Staff, HQ Allied Rapid Reaction Corps. Major General Bennett, thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Andy.
Would you be able to just give us the what, why, where, how of capability before we go into any other questions?
Yes, of course. And I suppose in that sort of typical interview approach, I should say that I'm now Director Futures. And the thing is behind me with the terminology explaining some of what that means as of yesterday. And of course, the logic of that is that in the Army Headquarters reorganisation, we have acknowledged that we need to get ahead of the bang, as it were. And so create an organisation whose focus is on the next integrated review and how we are going to meet that in a sort of multi-domain way, which is evidenced, and create the concept or evolve the concept from our future land combat system concept and narrative from this integrated review that meets the sort of demands of the future. And of course, you know, that links into your what, why, where and how, etc. You know, we clearly need to continue to evolve and indeed transform on the basis of the sort of revolution of the Internet of Things, the fact that adversaries are changing faster in some cases than we are. And I think my sort of having come from a sort of Finn Milcap background, my sense is that a lot of this is driven by the money, and of course it's driven by the capability and the policy as well and other factors. But the two big costs in the program are of people and equipment, and perhaps a third is logistics. And so I don't think we can afford to have large modernized forces anymore. You either have a large unmodernized force, which is what the army has been, and you know, recently in recent years, or you have a small modernized force, which is really what the Navy and the Air Force have been doing. And I think the next integrated review is much more likely to take us down one or other of those paths. And I think the look that, you know, where we will see this going is to smaller, more modernized, transformed forces. And what's really important for us, and you know, the answer to the why is we've got to get our concept for the future agreed by the centre in that context of multi-domain integration in a way that enables us to win the resource to modernise the army and probably make it smaller as a result. And if we don't get that right, the risk is we simply end up with a smaller, unmodernised force. So I think, you know, that leads us to, well, what does that look like? I think we're broadly happy with the future land combat system narrative from this integrated review, Andy, and that sort of talked, as you know, to a greater persistence of forward engagement, and we can sort of touch on the implications of Afghanistan and all that sort of thing if you want to. And also at its heart is the concept of a digitalized, data-driven network, which creates for you this multi-domain integration that creates a concentration of force and doing the great British thing of using other people's stuff. And that's precisely what I think we're trying to get at, and what the Americans are calling joint all-domain C2, where you can connect sensor shooters and deciders in a way that's quicker than the adversary, so that you've got the greater persistence of forward engagement, which gives you a better understanding of a problem, which means you can anticipate it rather than react to it, which is the key difference. and that you can anticipate it in a way that you can stay ahead in terms of tempo. That does make you susceptible, I think, to single points of failure within that network. And again, we can come back to that sort of thing if you want to. And I think what we're trying to do is sort of create within that a shift from what we are now, which is a largely human enterprise, into something that is more of a human machine teamed approach through the modernisation as a result of this integrated review. And then really seek to, through concept of changing concepts and innovation, research, experimentation, transformed through a sort of human machine team to a machine human teamed approach, you know, in that 2035, 2040 sort of era, where you are doing what the future operating concept sort of talked about fighting more at range and fighting more virtually, spending less on platforms and more on the effect that comes with that. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But of course, there is a cultural versus narrative tension here, which is that we are talking about doing more in the deep and more virtually, and yet our culture always drags us into the close and the physical. And again, you know, we can explore a bit more of that if you want to. But where I think that we might have a compromise in that tension is in Project Mercury, where what we're looking to do is create effectively this logic of privileging the deep into microcosm. And what that really means is that acknowledging that you need to take your soldiers still into the I say the fight, but into the decision space, if you like, you know, because the land environment is where the people live and the decisions are made. There is still a requirement to protect those people, and Chilcott tells us about graduated protection as the sort of context changes. So if you're able, rather than spending ever more money on protected vehicles, to offboard the protective mechanisms like active protection systems, like, you know, sort of ground penetrating radar, like sort of UAS that have got radio frequency jamming, etc., and other effectors, and like other capabilities, you know, electric armor and stuff. Should that be proven useful again? It means that fundamentally you've got a modular off-board protection system that you can shift from one platform to another. So it's not sort of platform specific, and it reduces the cost of the platforms as a result. And that helps you with the logic of reducing having fewer people in the fight, reducing the cost of the platforms, and because of electrification, which is part of this sort of wider system, reducing your logistic burden because you're not spending as much on kinetic energy because you're using laser energy, and 3D printing means you've got less of a spares thing, and the reduction in cost of people, equipment, and logistics means you can afford this technology that I've just described in a way that currently we struggle to. And then I think the how, I sort of touched on that, but we are creating this ecosystem. This is back to this very first observation about D futures. We're creating an organization that is focusing on the important more than the urgent, which has historically been the opposite for me. And people on Twitter have been saying, you know, well, both are important. And of course they are, but it's about where your balance of effort sits. And it's also within the Army operating model about outsourcing a lot of the urgent to the people who deal in the urgent, which is the field army, rather than us doing it in a strategic headquarters here. So it's making sure that things sit in the appropriate place. So you've got a new futures set up. Within that, you've got the Army Rapid Innovation Exploration Laboratory, which has been a sort of cottage industry really, and we're looking to put more people into that and more money, so that effectively a bit like the US cross-functional teams, you've got people in there who can knock down all of the commercial barriers and legal barriers and requirements barriers as they emerge in your procurement journey. We're creating concurrently an experimentation group, which should be an OF5-led amalgam, if you like, of the trials and development units that currently do technical experimentation, and we currently outsource the tactical to the field army. But if you've got a force, the 2 Yorks, who is specifically designed for that purpose, and then an OF5 headquarters that can actually learn the lessons of tactical and technical experimentation, and align that to what new tech is out there being looked at by Ariel. Ariel, if you like, is your filter friend. So you've got your concept derived by futures. Ariel then sort of says, well, what technology is out there that is useful to derive or to develop that concept? And then how do we experiment with it through the Experimentation Force, manifest through our battle lab down on the Dorset Tech Park. So imagine a sort of 2-story hangar with the software and hardware bit, so you can have the hybrid vehicles that can do neutral turning that we've all sort of now seen, with people bolting on UAVs and UGV wingmen and so on, and then trialing it on the sort of 5G airspace and so on down the road in Lulworth. As well as last point really, institutionalizing and putting on a proper war footing, if you like, our army warfighting experiment, which a lot of people will have been involved in and know pretty well, but sort of focusing it on the urban context, because we know that we've ignored that, or we haven't sort of privileged it properly for the last few years, and looking at how you create this joint all domain C2 by going through a process of understand and enable and so on and so forth, and replicating our network, the MANA network itself, a sort of emulation of Elitaxis, or what we think Elitaxis will be, so that down in this garage of the battle lab, you've not just got the physical vehicles with stuff going on, but you've also got the network being developed and connecting the network. And this for me is what success looks like. And you know, we have, as well as this focus on, I mean, I'll come up with a load of catchphrases, but you know, there's the urgent versus the important. There's also the physical and virtual. And we in CAP capability have historically focused on the physical, with info focusing on the virtual, and never the twain shall meet. Of course, that's way out of date, and we have evolved towards that, but Futures is by design a blend of the physical and the virtual, and is much more cross pan DLOD, the defence lines of development, than we've been historically, and that's the sort of logic of that. And the idea of this ecosystem that I've just described is that we are better able, if you like, to bridge this so-called valley of death between experimentation and acquisition. And we do that really by getting the commercial bit right at the front end, telling people that we're experimenting in order to acquire or buy and try at scale, etc. And I think we'll have a more mature process and procedure to all of that. There are lots of implied questions in what I've said, and I'll happily sort of deal with them with you and others as we go through. But that's a long answer to your first question.
All of which, everything you've said there, if we unpack it and take it all out in further questions. I mean, one of the big challenge that any military faces is transforming in peacetime for the war of tomorrow, and that idea of adaptability and change, adaptation and change, which is the real tension between managing an armed forces in a daily basis and then actually seeing how that armed forces reacts and operates under tension and friction in combat, because you're never going to have exactly the right people in the right kit for the specific of the war that you're fighting at that time. With this big bet on technology as the force multiplier, as the enabler of choice, how are you leveraging emergent technology, and are there any specific areas where you see positive potential growth for the future?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of comments on your comments, if you like. You know, it's interesting, we talk about war of tomorrow, and I think others would sort of talk about conflict rather than war, perhaps, and it being every day and us being in this constant state of competition, etc. Which I think is where we're sort of where the integrated operating concept is focusing us. But you're right to highlight that we also need to be prepared for war and our role in that war fighting of tomorrow. And I was sort of reminded when you were sort of saying about you know, sort of that transition and adaptation, about that phrase of, you know, you never get it right, but you don't want to be too far wrong. And I think it was the Eisenhower. I really quite like the Eisenhower quote about sort of plans are nothing, but planning is everything. You know, so that's not just a throwaway comment. It does make you remember that our people are actually just as important in this as the tech. You know, and what really historically has mattered is our ability to adapt the technology. You know, as the Japanese did with the car industry, as much as the technology itself. And it's making us think that perhaps the answer is, you know, is not always looking for the biggest high-tech changes, etc. You know, Viz, F-35, Viz, Ajax, etc. But to look at the incremental tech changes and how you can. I think you sort of cited this in a question or a note to me before. You know, you make the whole greater than some of the parts, and that's really where, you know, clearly we've got to focus on our people, and we've got to make sure we've got the right skill sets and mindsets for the future, which I think we are doing through Project Castle. Things like the collective training transformation plan are quite useful in this regard. You know, it is not just a retention and recruiting positive thing, but by using this virtual reality in land training and other sort of pilots, you do create a system which is interactive, and the machine learning means that you can evolve from simply training into mission rehearsal, which forms a level of protection, you know, all of its own, and helps you to adapt to the thing that you're engaged in. But it's interesting, this phrase of a bet on tech, which I know is the DCGS's phrase at the moment. I mean, if you examine that, I think that the key thing to pick out of that is that it's more of a risk than a gamble, and you know, a bet technically I think is more of a gamble than it is a risk, and I think what we're doing is more of a risk by which you understand the journey that you're on and are able to mitigate the implications of things not going quite as you had expected, whereas a gamble is a sort of binary, you either win or you don't win sort of thing. And so in terms of emerging tech, I think what we're doing is, it sounds very grand, it's not supposed to, at the 4-star level, so the Army headquarters as opposed to in the field army, is we're looking at what does genuine transformation look like, and what are the sort of constituent elements of that. And so we start with transformation looks like our FLCS concept with a sort of human-machine team, machine-human teamed outcome to it. And that sort of as a result, you sort of need to have a number of focal areas. And when we looked at this, we worked out what our capability challenges were, and there are about 103 of them, and we narrowed them down to 5, which was about electrification or alternate fuel systems, novel weapons, which connects obviously to electrification, and so on. The sort of AI, ML, artificial intelligence, machine learning, decision advantage thing, remote autonomous systems to do the dull, dangerous and dirty, and the sort of networking of sensors and effectors. And so we think that those are the sort of 5 things, which if we feed those 5 things through Aerial as our filter friend into the Army warfighting experiment as a sort of set piece event that goes through understand, learn, adapt and so on phases, we will be, and in conjunction with the Ministry of Defence's science and technology priorities, where there is resource at significant scale behind this sort of stuff, that will help us to genuinely transform. But at the same time, we need to blend our modernisation approach, i.e. buy something new like the AH-64E, with loyal wingmen and that sort of concept which kind of exists now, so that you are modernising incrementally, much of which you can outsource to the field army, as well as sort of seeking to transform. So you're doing a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach to how you change. And I think that combination reduces your risk in terms of emergent tech. I think my last point on this would be to say that where we are weak at the moment is in terms of our capacity. And inevitably with the reduction in size of the force, you have to think differently about your whole force approach, and indeed how you sort of crowdsource your ability to make this stuff work. So I see futures as the sort of hub and spoke network or ecosystem that involves industry in a big way and academia in a big way, and we are sort of harnessing the ideas of others to mutual benefit, which takes us back to this sort of commercial point of getting the commercials right at the front end. And the land industrial strategy is sort of telling us that we should focus on a minimum viable product approach to things rather than exquisite requirement sets, which then themselves change and make things more complex as we go through those programs. And then a sort of spiral development approach after that, a bit like is done through sort of software in an agile process now, but we apply that to our system and indeed to our hardware as well. So I think that would be my answer to how you turn sort of the harnessing of emerging tech from a gamble into a managed risk.
That's really interesting what you're saying about the bottom down and the top up approach. Coming from a naval background, that was very much the thinking behind the Type 23 into the Type 26 frigates. The idea that you trial the kit operationally, you upgrade what you've already got, trial it, and then you roll out the next iteration as the next platform comes online, or the next leap. And also what you were saying there about pulling in gaining the capacity by pulling in the networks of people and the network of thinking from around the wider populace and population. And I think one of the things that we don't often talk about, but is up there when we're talking about the integration of domains, is the cognitive domain. How do we integrate thinking, not just from within our own silo, but from other silos? And really, I see that as one of the slight issues with IOPC from a personal perspective, because all of this about creating a leaner, more high-tech, modernised army in line with the RAF, in line with the Royal Navy's direction of travel. Well, actually, how are we integrating those domains and the cognitive domain so that the military as a whole works together instead of in its silos, and does become that more than just the sum of its parts? Are you seeing, is that something that futures, that capability are working on at the moment and seeing real progress on?
So if you said to me, have we seen real progress on it? I probably would say we have seen progress, but we perceive real progress to be, just down the road. So I think we've started on this journey rather than are seeing real progress already. But that might be to underplay it. But that's me trying not to let my sort of optimism bias play out too much. I mean, I think there's a real role for the UK Stratcom here to sort of, and they are playing this role, to cohere the multi-domain integration, and they have a change program for that purpose. And there are a number of systems within that which are looking to sort of focus on particular areas, whether that's sort of swarming drones or more in the sort of network and an AI space, to ensure that we're all that where there is mutual benefit for more than two domains, rather than just a sort of bilateral arrangements which already exist, or for single service stuff. And I think it's important to remember the role of director digitization in here as well. And the team under the CIO, making sure that we get the sort of architectures and standards right, the rules of the road, as Caroline Bellamy calls it, so that we're all operating within a sort of common framework, and then enabling us to work bottom up. As long as you're within that framework, you can do whatever you like. So it doesn't stifle the very innovation that we're trying to sort of get after. And I guess I would sort of say the cognitive domain, I think, is more advanced in this regard. We have had a joint staff college for 20 plus years now. We don't conceive in stovepipes in the way that 25 years ago we absolutely would have done. And I've worked in a lot of joint environments in my time, and people are genuinely joint, and their focus is on the best outcome for defence. So I must admit I'm pretty positive about most of this, but I would agree with you that that it will take a while yet to sort of to actually achieve it.
Thank you. I'm very conscious of time and we're going away. I've got really one more question. It comes back to something you said at the beginning about how culturally we like to be, for want of the infanteer phrasing, to be up close and personal, to defeat and destroy the enemy in that tactical face-to-face battle, as it were. Now, one of the things that came out of the integrated review was the establishment of the Ranger Regiment. Now, where do you see the utility of that new cat badge fitting into the spectrum in what is a really competitive field already, in terms of you've got SFSG, you've got the Commando Force, you've got 16 Air Assault and everything they've just done. Where do you see the Rangers actually having a unique selling point that adds to defence?
Yeah. So I think there's one way of looking at it would be to say it's very competitive out there. But I think if you were a marketeer, you would sort of look to increase the size of the market, and I think that's what the IOPC is doing. It's saying there's more to be done in the operating space than we have done, and that we should therefore increase the opportunity in this area, and therefore we need more people to do this. And that's, I think, the sort of start point of the logic. And I think then you can sort of draw a triangle from the top down that sort of sees the SF being refined into doing what only they are able to do, rather than more generic tasks, because they've been the only show in town. Supported by the SFSG, which is the SFSG's job. Then you have the Rangers that sort of sit below that, who are doing sort of train, assist, enable, and indeed accompany in sort of high threat environments where there is a nuancing of the permissions and threat that is required, which is different to the SFA, which is really operating in a very overt, partnered way. And then I guess you've got the traditional 3 and 16 Brigade, now called Feature Commando Force, as you rightly said, and the Global Response Force. And we see that the Global Response Force is doing what it did last week, going at rapid speed and doing something that is really quite hard work, and requires a certain sort of, we are going to do this full stop mentality, which is very similar, I think, to the FCF, although the FCF, I think, is looking to operate more specifically, I'm not an expert in the FCF, in the littoral, and in areas such as the High North and east of Suez, and have a degree of persistence of engagement in those specific areas, whereas I think, as you'd expect, the land environment to focus more on the sort of deep land. So I think my answer would be to say I think we create a larger demand. Now others might say, well, where is that demand, and so on. But I think it's one of those things where that has been the demand that is perceived, and we'll see whether it works or not.
Thank you. When you were talking there about engaging that persistent and slightly more higher threat environment, the one thing that I started thinking about was Dauphin. and the 1970 to 1975, the advisors who are on the ground embedded with the Omani regiments, 2 years actually gaining that fighting experience. And is that the kind of model that you foresee going forward, where you have these highly motivated volunteers who are out there for that prolonged period? You develop that deep engagement with local forces, and develop both the capability, but then also acting in that contest space that we're talking about so much now.
It's certainly, I think, about the longer term engagement and understanding, as you've described. Some people say, well, isn't that what you had in Afghanistan? And therefore, we've got to have a really good look at this model and make sure that it does survive contact with what's just happened. And we've got to look at why all of that has happened, not all of which I think is fully clear. But yeah, I think that's broadly the logic.
Well, thank you, sir. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. That's been an absolutely fascinating view of how you manage transformation, how you set a direction for armed forces in a strategic manner. And I think there's so much there that it is new ground and new territory for everyone. So seeing this evolve and seeing this adapt going forward is going to be a fascinating case study, not just for us, but for our European partners and our NATO partners. So Major General Jez Bennett, thank you very much for joining us today. That was a fantastic interview.
My pleasure. Thank you, Andy.
A Call to Arms is part of the Military Sciences Profession of Arms programme. The show is produced by Peppy Van Arnen and Chris Jones and is sponsored by Airbus. If you enjoyed the show, please rate it and leave a review. Your feedback helps us tailor future interviews to what you, our audience, want to know. RUSI is a membership organisation, and it is thanks to our members and sponsors that we are able to maintain our independence, challenge orthodoxy, and deliver groundbreaking thought leadership. If you consider yourself to be connected to the profession of arms, then perhaps membership is for you. You can find more information at rusi.org/membership. For less than the price of a good cocktail each month, you can join a growing global community with exclusive access to events, research, and insights that put you ahead of your peers. Thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to welcoming you back next month for more from A Call to Arms.